Good afternoon and welcome to another one of Silver Law's 10-minute takeaways. Today I'm joined by Onaiza Khokhar, who is the immigration lawyer for Silver Law, and she's going to be talking to us about some key changes to the right to work checks, which will be applicable from the 1st of July. So welcome, Onaiza.
Welcome. Thank you, Julie.
Before we go into the changes, can you just explain a little bit of the background about when and why right to work checks are carried out?
Certainly. So right to work checks are an obligation that all employers in the UK need to carry out in order to ensure that employees have permission to work in the UK. In line with government guidance, the checks can actually be carried out as late as on the first day of employment. However, I always recommend that they're done in advance, and there's reasons for that. So one, you've asked the employee to turn up with the requisite documents and they've forgotten, then their start date needs to be delayed. That's something no employer wants to be left in the position in. Worse yet, the employee turns up with a fraudulent document, which means not only can the right to work check not be carried out, and not only is there a delay, but the employer actually needs to start a search for a brand new employee to replace the individual they thought was going to start that day. So for that reason, I highly recommend that checks are actually done as far in advance as possible before the employment actually starts. And it's important that checks are not only done before employment starts, but also if a check was done before the employee starts and it turns out that the individual has temporary right to work, then the individual needs to have a follow-up check done before their visa expires. So for example, the individual has a spouse visa which permits them to work, but it's going to expire in March next year. The employer needs to set, alarm bells to make sure that they cannot forget to do the subsequent right to work check before their visa expires. And again, I recommend not just flagging that with the employee a few days before to say, oh, bring in your documents, but actually speak to them a month in advance and say, have you got everything in place to apply for your extension or indefinite leave or whatever it is they are going to be applying for, to just get things done in advance. Again, that's not Home Office guidance, that's my recommendation, so that the employer isn't stuck in a situation where they can't continue their employment and they're finding out at the last minute.
Yeah, that makes obviously perfect sense. Okay, so what is the process that an employer needs to take to carry out a right to work check?
Yeah, so the process itself is not complex if you know what you're doing. It's a three-step process. So the first step is to obtain the original versions of the acceptable documents. Mm-hmm. It can be easier said than done if you don't know what the acceptable documents are. Mm-hmm. So I'll give some more guidance on that a bit later in the discussion, but essentially to get the original documents that you need. Step two is to make sure that you check the validity of the documents in the presence of the document holder. So there's no point the employee, couriering their British passport to you. You have to actually check that British passport in front of the employee, so you can compare the photo on the ID with the person next to you, so you can say, yes, this is the right person, the document is legit, and you can carry out the check, which leads us on to step three, which is to make and retain clear copies of the documents and also record the date on which the check was made, which is very important, because what you don't want is for the Home Office to come in for an audit at a later date and say, well, there's no date on this. How do we know you didn't do this check yesterday? And actually you did it a year ago when the individual started. So that's very key. And so that's the three steps. And in terms of retaining the documents, the employer needs to ensure that they retain the documents for the entire duration of the employee's employment and also for 2 years after that, which is quite a key thing that some employers forget. They sort of think, okay, the employee's no longer with us, we can get rid of that sort of HR file. They must keep it for a further 2 years.
Okay. So what changes are being made to right to work checks from the 1st of July?
Yeah, so essentially, for me to explain the changes, what I'll do first is explain to you what the process was up until now. So in terms of in the lead up to Brexit, the government introduced a new points-based system, which, as well as applying to non-EEA nationals, would going forward apply to EEA nationals. And so when Brexit took place at 11 p.m. on the 31st of December 2020, instead of the government saying, okay, that very minute, that's the cutoff, what they did was allowed a 6-month grace period, if you like, within which the old rules for right to work checks would continue to apply. So that gave European nationals a period of time, 6 months, within which to sort of get their new visa or status sorted, so that they can show the right evidence they need to for right to work checks going forward from 1st of July. So before 1st of July, a European national could have got away with just showing their European passport or nationality ID card alone to prove their right to work check. Here's my French passport, I'm French, so I'm allowed to work. Going forward from 1st of July, that is no longer sufficient. So the individual needs to have a evidence of permission in addition to their European ID to show that they have the right to work in the UK. That applies to all EEA nationals and Swiss nationals as well. But it's an exception to that is Irish nationals, because they have a separate permission to work. So actually an Irish passport on its own will suffice as a right to work check, but that's the only European national that applies to. Other European nationals need to show that they have permission to be in the UK. So one form of that permission is to have settled status in the UK. So if they can prove that, then that will satisfy a right to work check. Or if they've got limited stay, so pre-settled status, that would meet the right to work check. There's various other visa types, like a frontier worker visa and other visas types that European nationals can have in their own right. They can also have visas as dependents on other people. So for example, a European national could have a spouse visa if they're married to a British person. That will also enable them to work in the UK, so will also satisfy a right to work check. So there are various visas they can hold, but you need to ensure you are checking the visa, not just the nationality, going forward 1st July onwards. And it's really important that employers understand the changes that have taken place, because failure to carry out an adequate right to work check can actually end up meaning costly fines and sanctions, even criminal convictions up to a period of 5 years for a serious case of having illegal workers work for you. So it really is important to make sure that the checks are done adequately.
Okay, yeah, no one needs that sort of trouble. You mentioned there can be sanctions for not carrying out right to work checks adequately. So what do you recommend that employers do to ensure that they comply with the changes?
Yeah, so like I said, the right to work check is a 3-step process. On paper, it's fairly easy, but the employer needs to ensure that they know what document meets the check to make it adequate. So the key thing for them to do is ensure that they have the correct procedures in place to carry out adequate right to work checks. So that means, training their staff, the individuals who actually do the checks. There's no point, the top boss knowing the requirements, but the HR who actually does the check not knowing the requirements. Yeah. So, ensuring that staff are trained, and it's not a case of, one-off training, because it needs to be ongoing, because the guidance is forever changing. If we look at the last date on which the guidance was last updated, it was 18th of June. It can be changed at any point in time. So it is important to keep looking, referring back to the guidance. Don't just have one set of rules that you've written down separately based on the guidance at the time, because it's forever changing. So staff need to be updated and trained and keeping up to date with ongoing changes. If an employer is unsure where to find the guidance, it is on the government website, but they can get in touch with me and I'll be happy to just send them a link to the current guidance. and they can sort of take it from there. If they've got questions, they can also reach out to me as well. I also offer something, one of the services I offer is to ensure that right to work checks have been done correctly. So if an employer is unsure that they have been doing it correctly or wants to get some training done from us, we can offer that service and not only check and audit their right to work checks, but also teach them if there's anything that's incorrect, how they should change it and do it correctly going forward.
Okay, so it's a case of embedding it in their sort of standard operating procedures, really.
Yeah.
Okay, and you're going to be talking to us more in depth about this. We're running a seminar for you on Wednesday, the 20th of October, 6 p.m. So if anyone would like a place on that to hear more about what Onaiza has to say about right to work checks, please email us on seminars@silverllp.com. But in the meantime, if you have any specific queries for Onaiza, she's happy to take emails, as she said. It's Onaiza Khokhar, which is ONAIZAKHOKHAR at silverllp.com. Please feel free to drop her a line. She'll be happy to offer some advice to you. So, okay, thank you, Onaiza, for that really useful sort of small but important points there about the key changes. And we look forward to seeing you on the 20th of October when you'll be telling us more.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
Bye.